Federalist number 47, written by James Madison. This essay sits at the heart of one of the most important ideas in the modern constitutionalism, the separation of powers. But where did the idea come from, and how did Madison defend it against its critics? Federalist number 47 is Madison's attempt to explain philosophically and historically why the Constitution does not violate the principle of separating legislative, executive, and judicial powers, even though the branches share powers in some places. To understand why Federalist number 47 exists, you have to picture the political climate of 1787 1788. The Constitution had just been drafted, but it wasn't law yet. The states had to ratify it, and opposition was fierce. The Anti-Federalists, thinkers like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Brutus, argued that the Constitution created a dangerously powerful national government. They believed it concentrated authority in a way what would eventually crush liberty. One of their loudest accusations was that the Constitution violates the sacred principle of separation of powers. They believed the new federal government blended powers between the branches, especially because the legislature could impeach, the president could veto, and the judiciary was appointed by the executive and confirmed by the Senate. To Anti-Federalists, this looked like a recipe for tyranny. Madison responds in Federalist 47 with a mix of philosophy, history, and constitutional analysis. He says, quote, "Let's define what separation of powers actually means. Let's look at the historical sources and let's see whether the Constitution actually violates it." That sets the stage for the entire essay. Madison's central argument can be summarized in one elegant line. That is, the branches of government must be separate, but they do not need to be totally disconnected. This is the heart of Federalist 47. He argues that the principle of separating powers is not about keeping the branches absolutely distinct with zero interaction. Instead, the principle means this: no single branch should possess the whole power of another, which means the executive cannot also legislate. The legislature cannot also judge. The judiciary cannot also execute the laws. But some overlap, some partial mixing is necessary for checks and balances. This is incredibly important because critics assumed the separation of powers means no branch should have anything to do with another. But Madison says if that were true, no government on earth could function. Madison begins by addressing the anti-federalist misconception directly when he says absolute separation of powers does not exist in any workable government. He makes two arguments. The first argument is that no historical government has ever achieved pure separation. Even the British Constitution, the model admired by the founders and the one that influenced Monarchy, had extensive blending of powers. The king participated in lawmaking, parliament held judicial functions, judges were appointed by the executive, and yet the system was widely praised as a balanced and free government. And the second argument he provides is that even the state constitutions of America violate the total separation. And this is Madison's strong weapon. He goes state by state and points out that governors often had legislative powers. Legislatures often appointed judges. Judges sometimes had executive responsibilities. In other words, if the states themselves, which anti-federalists often praised, did not practice absolute separation, why criticize the federal constitution for doing the same? His message is clear. Separation of powers has never meant isolation. It means preventing the concentration of all power in one branch. Madison realizes that critics of the Constitution rely heavily on one philosopher, Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu's book, The Spirit of Laws, written in 1748, is one of the most influential works in the political theory. It is where the phrase separation of powers really enters modern political vocabulary. The Anti-Federalists treated Montesquieu like scripture. They said, Montesquieu says power must be separate. The Constitution mixes them, therefore the Constitution violates the liberty. And Madison's reply was genius. He said, essentially, you are misquoting Montesquieu. Let's read him carefully. Madison explains 3 points about Montesquieu's theory. Montesquieu never said powers must be completely isolated. That was the first point of his theory. Montesquieu recognized that some blending was not only normal but necessary. For example, the British king had a veto. The House of Lords functioned like a judicial body. Parliament influenced executive power. If Montesquieu admired the British system, then clearly he did not believe in absolute separation. Montesquieu cared about preventing tyranny, not enforcing a technical rule. Madison puts it very plainly: the accumulation of all powers in the same hand is tyranny. The point of separation of powers is to stop the accumulation, not to create a rigid wall. The third theory of Montesquieu is that Montesquieu believed liberty is protected when powers overlap enough to check each other. And this is the most important idea in both Federalist 47 and the entire constitutional system. Each branch must have constitutional control over the other branches. Without some mixing, without checks and balances, separation of powers collapses. Madison used Montesquieu to argue the exact opposite of what the critics thought. A system with partial blending is closer to Montesquieu's ideal than one with total separation. After defending the principles and analyzing Montesquieu, Madison asks, does the Constitution actually violate the separation of powers? He goes feature by feature. The Constitution does not violate the separation of powers. The president have too much legislative power? No. He can veto, but Congress can override the veto. This is a check, not a fusion of branches. Does Congress dominate the executive? Congress can impeach, override, vetoes, confirm appointments, but the executive has veto power, command of military, authority over foreign affairs. Again, a balance, not domination. Are the courts too connected to the other branches? Judges are appointed by president and confirmed by the Senate. Yes, but once appointed, they serve for life during good behavior. This insulates them from the political pressure. Madison ultimately concludes the Constitution keeps the branches separate enough to avoid tyranny, but connected enough to restrain each other. The blending is not a flaw, it is the feature that makes the entire system work. Human nature requires both separation of powers and checks and balances. Madison understands something profound, that human beings seek power. Institutions drift toward dominance. Power naturally accumulates unless something stops it. So he set up a system where each branch has just enough authority to prevent any other branch from growing too powerful. This is not just political engineering, it's a philosophical anthropology. Madison believes that humans are flawed. Ambition is natural. Conflict between branches can preserve liberty. His later essay, Federalist No.51, famously expresses the idea that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Federalist 47 is a theoretical foundation explaining the separation of powers means. Federalist 51 is the mechanical application explaining how it works. Federalist 47 remains unbelievably relevant in the modern politics. Look around, debates over the presidential power, fights between Congress and the White House, judicial independence, executive orders, impeachments, court packing proposals, emergency powers. All of these things are on the same question Madison wrestled with. How do we keep the branches separate enough to protect liberty but connected enough to check each other? Every decade of American political life replays this tension. Madison's insight is that a functional republic is not clean, simple, or mechanically perfect. It's a living tension, a balanced struggle between the institutions. And Federalist 47 teaches us something that people still misunderstand. Separation of powers is not about keeping the branches apart. It's about preventing any branch from absorbing the others. That is the difference between the liberty and tyranny. So to summarize, Federalist No.47 is Madison's defense of the separation of powers. He clarifies that separation does not mean total isolation. monarchy never intended absolute division. The Constitution blends power just enough to maintain checks and balances. The ultimate goal is preventing the concentration of all powers in the same hands. In Madison's views, liberty depends not on the purity of separation but on the balance of institutions. And that insight, written 230 years ago, remains one of the pillars of the constitutional democracy. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Federalist number 47, consider leaving a review, sharing the episode, or sending it to a friend who loves political philosophy and the history of ideas. Till next time.